Alright, continuing on. Facilitated diffusion. So we've learned about diffusion, plain old general. We've learned about osmosis, which is the diffusion of water across a semi-permeable membrane. And now we're going to talk about facilitated diffusion. A few molecules, such as the sugar glucose, seem to pass through the cell membrane much more quickly than they should. One might think that these molecules are too large or too strongly charged to cross the membrane, and yet they diffuse across quite easily. How does this happen? The answer is that the cell membranes have protein channels that make it easy for certain molecules to cross the membrane. Red blood cells, for example, have a cell membrane protein with an internal channel that allows glucose to pass through it. Only glucose can pass through this channel, and it can move through in either direction. The cell membrane protein is said to facilitate or help. Mr. Worley, here's a great quiz question. Facilitate. What does facilitate mean? To help. The diffusion of glucose across the membrane. The process in figure 717 is known as facilitated diffusion. Hundreds of different protein channels have been found that allow particular substances to cross different membranes. Okay, facilitated diffusion right here. During facilitated diffusion, molecules such as glucose that cannot diffuse across the cell membrane's lipid bilayer on their own move through protein channels instead. Okay. Does facilitated diffusion require the use of any energy? The answer is no, it doesn't. Check it out. It's just basically a channel, just basically a gate or a pathway for glucose to get in and out of the cell. It's facilitated diffusion. It means it's helped along, but it isn't pushed. There's no energy used. Let's continue on. Although facilitated diffusion is fast and specific meaning what kind of molecules cross, it is still diffusion. Therefore, that movement of molecules across the cell membrane will occur only if there is a higher concentration on the side than the other side. This movement does not require the use of the cell's energy. I want you to know that for facilitated diffusion. Alright, I hope you're taking some good notes. If you're not, you better backtrack and make sure you do. Alright, please move on with me to page 188. Wow, we're getting there, class. We're getting there. 188. Alright, active transport. Start a new section in your notes, active transport. Let's read this neat little graph. Crossing the cell membrane. The cell membrane regulates what enters and leaves the cell and also provides protection and support. The core of nearly all cell membranes is a double-layer sheet called the lipid bilayer. We've learned about that. Most materials entering the cell pass through this membrane by diffusion. The graph shows the size of several molecules that diffuse across the lipid bilayer. Okay, so carbon dioxide does, and it's 50 daltons. Ethanol does, it's 50 daltons. Glucose does, it's 150 daltons large. Glycerol, oxygen, urea, and water. Okay. Which substances do you think will diffuse across the lipid bilayer most quickly and most slowly? Explain your answers. Let's see. Well, I would think that it has to do with size, so I would say water would go the most quickly and glucose would go the most slowly. Formulate a hypothesis about the relationship between molecule size and rate of diffusion. I hypothesize that the larger a molecule is, the slower it will go across the membrane. Design an experiment to test your hypothesis. Let you do that. Okay, moving right along. Active transport. As powerful as diffusion is, cells sometimes must move materials in the opposite direction, against the concentration difference. This is accomplished by a process known as active transport. As its name implies, active transport requires energy. The active transport of small molecules or ions across a cell membrane is generally carried out by transport proteins or pumps that are found in the membrane itself. Larger molecules and clumps of material can also be actively transported across the cell membrane by a process known as endo means in, cytosis means cytosis means cell, so into the cell, and exo, out, cytosis, out of the cell. The transport of these larger materials sometimes involves changes in the shape of the cell membrane. More about that in for future chapters. Molecular transport. Small molecules and ions are carried out across the membrane by proteins in the membrane that act as like energy requiring pumps. Can you think of any pumps, any energy requiring pumps in your life? Do you have a swimming pool? Do you have a bicycle tire pump? You have to put energy into it to make the pump go in? That's a great example. Air will not diffuse into your tire to a pressure that is necessary for riding your bike. But if you have an energy pump to put energy, use energy to put air into the tire, well, there you go. That's the same thing. Small molecules. Many cells use such proteins to move calcium, potassium, and sodium ions across the cell membranes. Ooh, I'd love you to know. What are 3 ions that usually require energy? Good quiz question. Alright. Changes in protein shape, as shown in figure 719, seem to play an important role in the pumping process. A considerable portion of the energy used by cells in their daily activity is devoted to providing energy to keep this form of active transport working. The use of energy in these systems enables cells to concentrate substances in a particular location, even when the forces of diffusion might tend to move these substances in the opposite direction. Move with me to page 189 at this time. And let's look at that figure, that really sweet figure right here. Basically, this is active transport. So molecules come into the protein that acts as the pump, then you add some energy, wazam, ka-chow, and it changes shape and molecules move in the cell. Opposite of diffusion. Active transport. Nice. This is really remarkable, class. This is how life basically works. It's all about active diffusion. Active transport. Endocytosis and exocytosis. Last page, guys. Here we go. Large molecules and even solid clumps of material may be transported by movement of the cell membrane. One of these movements is called endocytosis. Endocytosis, vocab word, is the process of taking material into the cell by means of infoldings or pockets of the cell membrane. The pockets that result break loose from the outer portion of the cell membrane and forms a vacuole within the cytoplasm. Ooh, we heard that word before. Large molecules, clumps of food, and even whole cells can be taken up in this way. 2 examples of endocytosis are phagocytosis and pinocytosis. Phagocytosis, meaning cell eating, want you to know that, vocab word. And quiz question, surround the particle and package it within the food vacuole. The cell then engulfs it. Amoebas use this method to take in food. Engulfing material in this way requires a considerable amount of energy and therefore is correctly considered a form of active transport. Now, in a process similar to endocytosis, many cells take up liquid from the surrounding environment. Tiny pockets form along the cell membrane, fill with liquid, and pinch off to form vacuoles within the cell. This process is called pinocytosis. Very similar to phagocytosis. Oh, pinocytosis is very similar to phagocytosis. You can think of phagocytosis as eating, and pinocytosis like sipping. Drinking. Pinocytosis is drinking, phagocytosis is eating. Many cells also release large amounts of material from the cell, a process known as exocytosis. During exocytosis out, the cell membrane of the vacuole the membrane of the vacuole surrounding the material fuses with the cell membrane, forcing the contents out of the cell. The removal of water by means of contractile vacuoles is one example of this kind of active transport. There we go. We are finished with section 7-3. Whew! That was a long one. Okay, remember, you have questions 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. 5 and 6 to do. I want you to make sure your notes are complete. Guys, if you met the requirements and got all of your notes in one page, I'm pretty impressed. Let's just quickly review what our learning objectives were. Identify the main functions of the cell membrane and the cell wall. Describe what happens during diffusion. And explain the processes of osmosis, facilitated diffusion, and active transport. If you can do those 3 things, you're going to rock the quiz. Make sure you know your vocabulary word. This is Mr. Worley saying, God loves you, and so do I, and this rocks. I will see you tomorrow for quiz time and our learning activity. Peace out.